Okay, folks, I am going to kick us off, I think. It's wonderful seeing everybody getting together and commenting on each other's lockdown here. I think it's a wonderful way to start the call. But why don't we get going? We want to start by saying a very big welcome to the July National Grassroots Conference Call for Results UK. I hope everybody continues to do well during the lockdown. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, the rules on social distancing were relaxed just on the weekend just gone. But we at Results, we're being very cautious at present. And so as of right now, our plans are very much for our staff to continue to work from home for the foreseeable future. All of our meetings with parliamentarians and civil servants are still happening online. And we see no appetite from any of them to move back to face-to-face meetings anytime soon either. So more on this later when we're going to hear how you've been getting on with virtual meetings with your MPs. If we've got anyone new on the call this month, a very particular welcome to you. My name's Erin Oxley. I'm the Executive Director of Results UK. Would anybody new want to introduce themselves or say hello to the network?
I can have a go, Erin.
Yeah, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie. I've just joined the London Results Group last month. Very excited to join this first speaker call and to learn a bit more. Thank you so much.
Lovely to have you, Jamie. Welcome. Anybody else want to say hi if they're here for the first time? It's not compulsory, but we'd love to welcome you.
I feel discriminated against.
Okay, Pete, why don't you introduce yourself? Go on.
Well, I've only just joined. Yeah, no, hello. I've just been here for years, so you know me. So sort of, go on, get on with it.
All right, Pete, fair enough. Right, thank you, Peter. All right, so later on this call, we're going to be hearing from a very special guest speaker on the topic of the planned merger between the Department for International Development, or DFID, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Now, I wrote to everybody via email shortly after the announcement made by Prime Minister Boris Johnson on the 16th of June. I know some of you have already been able to take some action on this, or you've got a meeting in with your MP in the diary. If so, thanks so much, and we hope you'll still find this call quite useful. For those of you that haven't been able to do so yet, I hope this call will help you to articulate why this change in the machinery of government is potentially quite a big risk in the fight against global poverty, and some of the ways that we can work to mitigate that risk. So before we jump into that though, I want to talk about a few other things that are changing the context in which Results works, and even really challenging and changing our understanding of what it is that we do and why we do it. Now, I know that each one of us has a very different and very personal motivation for taking action against global poverty. Some of us express it as anger for injustice. For others, there's a strong feeling of having a duty to act, of doing the right thing, of solidarity with those who, through no fault of their own, are denied the ability to live lives free of poverty. But whatever it is our personal stance, many of us share similar kinds of reasons for why we take action. Now, you won't have missed the huge impact of the Black Lives Matter movement recently, not only in the UK, but also in the USA, but also here in the UK and around the world, triggered by the deaths of George Floyd and others, showing once again how institutions and systems in the world are intrinsically oppressive to certain classes of people, and in particular, Black and other ethnic minority people. This movement is challenging us to re-examine our understanding of oppression as it relates to both Results work and the wider international development sector. Now, if you're wondering how this is related to our work, it's been articulated very clearly by our sister organization, Results in the USA, which, as well as having a global poverty program, also has a very strong domestic poverty program, which addresses head-on the racist elements of poverty in the US. I'm going to quote from my counterpart, Executive Director of Results US, her name's Joanne Carter. She says, "In our work on poverty, we see how decades and centuries of racist public policy led to where we are today. Our anti-racism work and our US advocacy on affordable housing, the insidious racial wealth divide, more equitable tax policy, they're all bound up together. That extends to our global advocacy, where the legacy of colonialism and other oppressive forces continue to drive inequity in health, education, and opportunity. And coronavirus is only widening inequalities created by racism. Now, Joanne has a whole lot more to say, which I would really urge you to go and read. We'll put a link to a blog post from her into the chat box just now. I think what's really important here is to remember that the UK is not America, but we have our own difficult history and relationship with slavery, race, and class that in many ways is even more difficult than America's. And before you start to think that this is someone else's problem, I want to be clear that the international development sector is far from immune. As just one example, for far too long, the work of development was thought of as the benevolent white savior rescuing helpless poor people, and still is by far thought that way by way too many people. This well-meaning but destructive white savior narrative denies people living in poverty their own agency, and even in some cases, full personhood. This thinking goes against everything we stand for in Results, and we believe all people have the ability and the right to exercise their own personal and political power for change. It's literally in our mission statement. And this is just one element of racism and oppression that's part of the work that we're engaging in. The key thing that I want to make clear to everybody on the call tonight is that we haven't yet critically examined our own work through the lens of anti-racism and anti-oppression. And I believe it's absolutely critical and important that we do. If we want to achieve our mission, we need to work to have a solid understanding of what it means to be anti-racist and to ensure we bring anti-oppression into our thinking and into our actions. Now, we're going to be running a session on this at our national conference in September, and it's important for us all to move forward together, to learn more about the extent and nature of our responsibilities to engage in the anti-oppression movement, particularly for those of us who think we don't have personal experience of race-based oppression or poverty, because this is something that affects literally everyone in different ways. Following Joanne's excellent blog post we shared earlier, I also wrote publicly to commit Results to doing more work on anti-oppression, which we're putting a link to in the chat box just now as well. I'd really encourage you to read both articles and perhaps begin to reflect on what this might mean for you in your advocacy and in your understanding of what development is. Now, I say this is important because it's important, and it's particularly important that we don't just deal with this in a tokenistic way or because it's the concern of the moment. These are serious issues which need a serious and sustained response. This is one that will challenge our assumptions and affect our behavior as individuals and as an organization. It's going to be work. So watch this space as we develop and implement an action plan. And if any of you would like to be more involved in this work, we'd really love to hear from you. Now, I'd like to mention a couple of news on some of the issues we've been working on. First, just after last month's conference call on Thursday, the 4th of June, the UK government co-hosted the Global Vaccine Summit, which was a moment for international donors to pledge financial support to Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. As many of you know, the UK had already pledged the equivalent of £330 million per year for the next 5 years to Gavi, something that many of you on this call campaigned long and hard for. The UK contribution alone will protect up to 75 million children in the world's poorest countries against diseases like measles, polio, and typhoid, and is a huge contribution to building the health systems needed to protect people for the future and overcome global poverty. On the 4th of June, the UK's pledge was followed up by other donors, and together, motivated in part by the extra challenges presented by coronavirus, the international community pledged a total of $8.8 billion in new resources over the next 5 years to Gavi. They smashed the target of $7.4 billion. This amazing commitment to global health will help to deliver more than 3.2 billion doses of life-saving vaccines to 300 million children by the year 2025. So let's celebrate our part in that achievement. This is one very compelling example of why the UK's global leadership on international development is so important. And again, we'll put a link to that announcement and our response in the chat box. Lastly, I wanted to update you on the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria's plans to gain additional resources to protect its work to combat those three diseases from the impacts of COVID-19. Now, if you were able to get involved with last month's campaign action, you'll know that these diseases are massively at risk of resurgence because of the COVID-19 pandemic through its impact on already stretched health systems. Now, since our June call, the Global Fund has released an analysis that shows a need for an additional $5 billion for its work, which it would spend over the next year, using its expertise to help fight the COVID pandemic and to protect against backsliding in the fight against the three diseases. They lay out the scale of the challenge and what the need is very clearly, and we're posting a link to that document in the chat box right now. If you want to look straight at the numbers, you can go to page 13. Otherwise, do look at the whole thing. It's really quite a good articulation of the challenges that we're facing right now. As of today, the Global Fund hasn't yet told us about a specific sum that we think the UK should be contributing. But your campaign action last month is really important in paving the way for this request in the coming weeks. Now, we've heard back from one or two of you that the UK's initial response isn't positive and that they don't think they need to invest any more money since the pledge they made to the Global Fund last year has already happened. Now, we know that needs to change, and we've got some ideas about how we could get it to change, but we need to coordinate further campaigning with the Global Fund's own plans for broader resource mobilisation. So do watch this space. Now, that's all I want to say right now. So I'm going to hand over to Della for the usual roundup of all your advocacy activities around the UK in the last month. Over to you, Della.
Thanks, Aaron. I just wanted to start off by welcoming Eleanor, who has been part of the Brighton group for a while, but has taken on the new role as group leader in Brighton. Maybe if you want to wave so everyone knows where you are. And also just really wanted to thank Sidonie and Hugh for all their hard work in the group leader role in Brighton previously. They basically set up the group from scratch and just did an amazing job. So yeah, thanks for all your hard work and welcome to Eleanor. Some of you will have met her already, of course. So yeah, I think we might have Yoasha from the Brighton group on the call. I'm hoping Yoasha is IR. Otherwise, I know we have Sidonie on the call. Yes, great. I was just going to ask one of you to maybe share a little bit about a recent MP meeting that you had.
Yeah,
it sounded like it went really well.
Yeah, it went really well. So on the 25th of June, Sid and I had a call with our MP for Brighton Kemp Town, Lloyd Russell Moyle. And he seemed really engaged with the issues we discussed with him, so we were really pleased with the outcome of the meeting. He spoke about his trip to Liberia with results a few years ago to visit drug-resistant TB patients, and we discussed with him some of the horrible side effects of the drugs used to treat, such as hearing loss. So that was an interesting conversation. And after the meeting, he sent our draft letter to the Secretary of State for International Development, asking that she supports investing in the Global Fund COVID-19 response mechanism. So that was a really good outcome. And then also we spoke to him about the DFID FCO merger, and then he told us that Labour are opposing the merger. He wasn't able to sign the motion until the Shadow International Development Secretary had signed it. He had opposing it and has also written 6 questions to be addressed to the MP, the House, DFID and FCO. So yeah, it's clear that he cares a lot about DFID and is trying to help as much as possible. So overall, I think we were both really happy with that call. Yeah.
Sorry, I just muted myself. Thanks so much, Yoasha. That's awesome. I think it's worth mentioning as well that you'd initially got an automated response back from him saying that you maybe weren't going to get a meeting, but that he then actually got back to you and said that he was willing to meet. So I think that's a good testament to the work you've put in before this moment as well to try and build that relationship. So awesome. Thanks for sharing. I know the Brighton group are working on your participation in a local COVIDarity festival, which is an online event coming up. So I'll put a link to that in the chat so everyone can see what that's about and maybe join if they'd like. Thanks to all the other groups who've been keeping me up to date so far as well on your MP meetings over the last sort of month or so. I know Edinburgh have one in the pipeline, Stoke Valley, a few of you have been writing letters back and forth, a few of you haven't necessarily been able to meet yet. I just wanted to open the floor a little bit and ask if anyone wanted to unmute themselves and share kind of what the process of getting hold of your MP has been like over the last month. Doesn't matter if it's positive or not so positive. Does anybody want to jump in?
Just to say, we were really pleasantly surprised. Our MP is a new Tory, fairly right-winger Brexiteer, but Jill had got some positive vibes about our work at the hustings. And it took a little while. There was probably a week, 2 weeks before they responded. But now we've got a 45-minute slot, not during the Friday slot. And we've kind of got special attention, and Jill, who's an expert at this, I'm not. You know, I just feel we're getting that special attention, and that's going to give us a slot. And when we met with our MP the last time, who was the previous, the incumbent, long-standing incumbent, we prepared a script, literally prepared a script to squash it in. We will do the same again, but we have the luxury of knowing that they're allowing us that time on a special slot, not just the ordinary slot.
That's awesome. Hopefully that will give you a little bit of confidence going into the meeting as well. Did you want to say something?
She's a brand new MP that was helicoptered in because she's a Brexiteer, and it was a safe seat. She'd already stood in 3 other places and not got in, so they parachuted her into this one against everybody. But I went to the hustings and I was really pleasantly surprised by the things that she was saying. She was making the right noises. So I made a note of everything, and I got it to parrot back to her, but how it fits in with our agenda, which is good. So we're building up a relationship with the people in the office as well, which is quite friendly, isn't it, Corinne? Which is good. That's really important, yeah. And hopefully the kind of research you've been doing to this point will pay off and help that meeting go a little bit smoother. So well done there. Does anyone from a different group want to share? I'm so open to hearing if it hasn't been going as well either. This is an open space.
Well, I'll say we have gotten, this is Kathy from the Edinburgh group, and we have got a meeting on Friday, but we'd first of all been hopeful for a special session, the longer one like Corinne was talking about, but now because of the lots of other things that are on her agenda, she's just asked us to join the constituency surgery. So we're not possibly going to have as much time, but as she is one of the sponsors of the early day motion, I have a feeling that she's going to be fairly reliable on the issues. So I think that as a Lib Dem, she's going to be okay. And she's someone other than the SNP who we've always had on our side, really. So it's good to be meeting somebody new that we think will be on our side.
Definitely. Congratulations for managing to branch out into another constituency as well. That's really exciting. Looking forward to hear how that meeting goes. So I'll move on just because of time, but always open to hearing how your planning is going. You can just drop me an email anytime about that. I wanted to move on and mention some fundraising that the pool group have been up to. I know Deirdre is on the call, maybe putting you on the spot a little bit here, Deirdre. Did you want to share what you've been up to? I've heard about plants and a garden sale, but I wanted to let you talk about it.
Normally we would have had our annual cream tea, which Janet organises, and we do sales of plants for that, and obviously it was cancelled, but I'd already started to grow some plants. So during lockdown, what I did was use the Facebook page of my village to advertise the plants over a short period of time and put them at the garden gate, and people put money in a box. It only raised £40, but anyway, it's £40.
I think we appreciate every penny. So yeah, thank you. Really awesome idea as well. Really creative. Thanks for sharing. So I think that was mainly it from me. I'm going to put a link into the latest news flash that we sent out in case you didn't catch that in your email inbox. And before I go, I just wanted to say thanks to those of you who joined the international conference sessions, which were the weekend before last. Yes, 2 weeks ago now, I think. It was great to see your faces. Hope you enjoyed the sessions. There's a little bit more about the international conference in the news flash as well, and the blog that Naveed wrote about how he found it. So yeah, please have a read. And yeah, as always, just keep letting me know if you've been taking action. It's always good to hear from you. And yeah, back to you, Erin.
Thanks very much, Stella. Excuse me. So let's, it's one of my favorite parts of the call to hear all the great stuff everybody's been up to. It's just so powerful. It really fills me with lots of energy. Let's jump onto the topic of tonight's call. It's really my pleasure to introduce our extra special guest this evening. I'm going to be introducing Stephen Twigg, who until he stepped down at the last general election was the Labour MP for Liverpool West Derby, having first entered the House of Commons in 1997. He's a former Minister of State for School Standards, Shadow Foreign Office Minister and Shadow Secretary of State for Education. In 2015, he became chair of the Parliament's International Development Select Committee, incredibly important committee. In that role, he had a really important job scrutinising government policy on international development and helping improve the standard and effectiveness of UK aid programs. He's had a long-standing particular interest in global education, and we're thrilled that very recently Stephen's been working in partnership with us, results, to form a new global network of parliamentarians called the International Parliamentary Network for Education. Stephen, welcome to the call.
Erin, thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to be here with you all this evening.
Thanks, Stephen. Now, look, we don't normally invite politicians onto our monthly calls because we don't want to reveal exactly how the sausage is made. But I hope you'll agree, everyone, that Stephen is a very special case. We could really hardly have hoped for a better informed person to be sharing his thoughts in terms of the topic of this month's discussion. So, Stephen, very big welcome to you. You're joining our monthly Grassroots conference call. You've seen the network of volunteer advocates and campaigners from right across the UK, from Scotland to the South Coast. Some have been active on global poverty issues for many, many years, Peter and others, and some who are brand new to results tonight. But everyone on the call is really keen to hear your experience of working to keep the UK's international development all as effective as it can be. So before we go to our first questions for you, I'm going to ask you to say a little bit about your passion for international development. What was it about your role as chair of the committee that spoke to you? And very briefly, what do you think has been the importance of the International Development Committee's work?
Thanks very much, Erin. And can I say, first of all, it was great to hear the reports from the different parts of the country, the group that are meeting with the newly elected Conservative Member of Parliament, the group meeting with, I think it's Chris Jardine in Edinburgh, and then the Brighton group with Lloyd. I mean, I was on that visit with results to Liberia with Lloyd, and Lloyd served in the previous Parliament on the International Development Committee. And I got interested in politics in its broadest sense when I was pretty young as a child. I remember in the 1970s, my mum and dad taking me on counter demonstrations against the National Front when the National Front were marching through predominantly black parts of North London, sort of Wood Green and that kind of area, and seeing that racism very explicitly at that time. And then as a student, very involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and also when I was at school getting involved with Amnesty International. So I always had a kind of broad interest in politics, not just party politics, but also in the international dimension, and seeing that justice was just as important on the other side of the world as it is in the communities in which we live. But I hadn't worked specifically in international development. And when the opportunity arose in 2015 to stand to chair the International Development Committee, I was delighted to have that opportunity. I think I learned a lot from the 4.5 years in which I worked in the committee, in particular about the importance and effectiveness of cross-party work on international development. Spending on aid and development assistance more broadly is highly scrutinised. We have a media that is often very critical, but we have in Parliament a broad cross-party agreement that the UK's long-standing commitment to spend at least 0.7% of our national income on development assistance is something we all want to uphold. And for me, when I think about the work we did in that committee, the big lesson I take from that is that working together, cross-party, including the real commitment shown by Conservative members of that committee, was very important. And we're going to talk tonight about the merger and how that will, what the effect of that will be. I think some of those allies on the Conservative side that have spoken up consistently for development and for 0.7% will be very important, as well as, of course, all of the opposition parties as well.
Stephen, thank you so much for sharing a bit of your personal motivation. That's also one of my favourite parts of the call, to hear how people get all fired up about this work. I just really do want to say again how grateful we all are at Results for the dedication to international development that you've shown, both while you were in Parliament and now outside of Parliament as well. We're going to jump ahead into going straight into the pre-arranged questions before we open up to the floor. Now, as usual, if you want to text in a question, you can do that. The number is the same as last month. It's 0777 56 11178. That's 0777 56 11178. And we will also open for people to yell out questions at some stage. And also, if you've got the chat box, you can put questions in there as we go. But without further ado, we'll go to our first pre-prepared question from Manchester, I believe.
Hi there, Cameron here from the Manchester group. Thanks for speaking to us, Stephen. It's also good to hear. Well, we're in one of the previous red wall seats, which is now turned blue. So it's good to hear about the cross-party, the potential for that collaboration and the support in Parliament. But yeah, so the first question is why should a change to the government department that spends the UK's overseas aid budget, why should that be a risk to the effectiveness of our aid programmes?
Thanks very much, Cameron. I think it strikes at the heart of this debate, and I think part of the answer is about the work that the Department for International Development has done over its 23-year existence. It has built up expertise and capacity. And I think that if this merger goes ahead, it's incredibly important, alongside some other things that I'll talk about, that expertise and capacity is sustained. When I chaired the International Development Committee, we looked at this question on a couple of occasions. And more recently this year, the new committee, chaired by a Labour MP, Sarah Champion, has looked at it again, and it's worth reading their report on this. DFID has consistently rated highly in a number of areas. For example, on the very important question of aid transparency, and the index that is published on a regular basis consistently compared to a range of organisations across the world, DFID is amongst the best. It consistently gets a very good, and the Foreign Office has fared less well. I would say, to be fair to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, they did a bit better in the more recent rating, so they have been doing some work to improve their rating on transparency. The way that I used to put it when I chaired the committee was that poverty reduction, and then I guess more recently the Sustainable Development Goals, are absolutely the core mission of the Department for International Development. And I think the risk is that might not be the case in a merged department. I think part of what we have to do, those of us who are concerned about this and those who are advocating, is to be making an argument about how, if there is to be this new department, those priorities of sustainable development and tackling poverty and inequality have to be in the core mission of that department in the way that they have been in the core mission of the Department for International Development.
Thanks, Stephen. That's great. A few key things for us to keep an eye out for there. We're going to go over to Stort Valley for our second question.
Jill, you're on mute.
Okay, yeah, unmuted. Is it really bad? I'm Jill from Stort Valley. Is it really bad to align the UK's diplomatic objectives with aid spending? Is it really bad?
Jill, thank you. I think the answer to that is no, it's not bad. I think in principle, aligning what you want to do on development with what you want to do on diplomacy makes a great deal of sense. And one of the things that the Select Committee does, and which we did when I chaired it, is to visit some of the countries in which the United Kingdom has significant programs of development. And I was always very struck when we went to countries like Kenya, Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, but also countries in the Middle East that have done a lot of work on the Syrian refugee issue, like Lebanon and Jordan, that there was typically very good cooperation between the diplomats and the people on the ground working for the Department for International Development. So I think that the principle of alignment between what you're saying in terms of your diplomacy, your politics, and what you're doing on development is a sensible principle. The question is what your priorities then are in that alignment. And one of the fears is, will we see a shift away from the focus on poverty reduction? Will we see a change in the priorities that the government has had and the Department for International Development has had? And in particular, I would say, might we see a change in the geography of where development assistance is focused? The Conservative government previously, towards the end of David Cameron's period as Prime Minister, really focused in on some of the poorest and most fragile countries to be the main beneficiaries of development support from the United Kingdom. And I think that had some issues because there's a lot of poverty in countries that then were no longer getting support from the UK in bilateral aid. But it did mean that the focus really was on some of the most challenging situations. There is a concern and a risk that there could be a shift away from that and that other objectives come into play in terms of future UK trade relationships, in terms of some of the security issues that have been raised. So I don't think there's any automatic problem with aligning them. And actually, if aligning them means that our diplomacy puts a bigger emphasis on sustainable development and climate change and tackling poverty and inequality, actually that's a really healthy feature of alignment. But if it heralds a shift in the priorities, that would be a concern. Now, to be fair, we can't be clear yet whether that shift will happen. Erin reported on some of the great commitments that have been made, thanks in large part to the advocacy efforts of people on the call, to Gavi, to the Global Fund. The UK's long-standing commitment on global health has been reaffirmed, to be fair, by the government, and the Prime Minister did that when he set out the proposal for the merger. The work that I've been doing results in establishing an international network of parliamentarians on education. There is a clear government commitment, particularly on girls' education, which is very, very welcome. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that having a single department will see a shift away from those causes that we all hold dear. But I think a very important part of your advocacy and all of our work over the weeks and months ahead is to press that if there is to be this new department, it must continue to give priority to these really important questions of sustainable development and tackling poverty and inequality around the world.
Thanks, Stephen. Very clear and helpful in terms of unpacking some of the subtleties and nuance there. It's very, very helpful to have that. We are going to go up to Edinburgh for the third pre-prepared question.
Okay, it's Kathy here from Edinburgh. And having signed at least 3 or 4 online petitions to try and reverse this decision, I am wanting to ask you, do you think it is possible that with sufficient pressure, the decision to abolish DFID as a separate department could be reversed?
My frank assessment is that it's possible but unlikely. So I would say to anyone who's campaigning on this, alongside campaigning on the main issue, there is a really important piece of work to be done around what would happen if this merger does go ahead. And that's partly what I was just talking about, which is about the priorities and keeping the focus on poverty reduction and the sustainable development goals. But also, I think very importantly, it's about accountability. So one of the issues that my successor, Sarah Champion, as chair of the International Development Committee, has been raising is what accountability the new department and the rest of government will have to Parliament on aid and development assistance more generally. I think this is very important. There is a good argument, for example, to say that you should still have a committee in Parliament that focuses on development and overseeing development spending. And I know that's what Sarah and others have been arguing for, and the results has been supportive of. I think there is a determination on the part of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary to proceed with this, and the government has a large majority. Therefore, I would be very surprised if it were to be reversed. I think it is important to use advocacy opportunities to both make the arguments, as you already are, around the real achievements of DFID and the risks that I've already talked about, but also to make the argument that if this goes ahead, there needs to be effective accountability and a really clear position from the government that the focus will remain on poverty reduction and the sustainable development goals. And obviously, the sustainable development goals were always a huge challenge for the international system, but in the context of the impact of the pandemic, it's that challenge has multiplied. And so I think for the UK to be really effective on the sustainable development goals requires any new department to have them as a priority, and certainly to be reaffirming the commitment to spending at least 0.7% of our national income on development as well. Sorry, that's in a sense, a slightly pessimistic answer, but that is my honest assessment based in part on what I know in terms of opinions on government backbenches and watching some of the debates that there have been in Parliament. There is a lot of strong opposition vocally from opposition parties, but my sense is that on the Conservative side, there is essentially unity in support of what the government is doing on the merger.
Thanks, Stephen. And thanks for all of those answers to those first 3 questions. I'm going to open up the floor now to anyone that would like to ask a question. I see we've got 1 or 2 that have landed in the chat box already. I'll curate those in just a minute. But for everybody else, we are going to open the floor. When you are speaking and asking your question, do introduce yourself and say where you're speaking from. We'll take as many as we've got time for. For those that are on the telephones or don't have access to the Zoom chat box for whatever reason, we'll get you to either unmute and yell out your reserve a spot verbally, or you can text in a question if you'd prefer to do that. I'll give you the number one more time. It's 0777 56 11178. That's 0777 56 11178. So let's jump straight into some of the questions. We've got 2 questions in the chat that I think Stephen has seen, because I see the look on his face. I'm going to ask them to him, knowing that he's pretty unlikely to be able to give us an answer, but I think they're important questions for us to be examining at least. One is from Peter. What is the government's underlying rationale for this change? So if you can Imagine yourself, Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab. That would be amazing. Please read their minds. And then the second question, also from Peter, I think an important question for all of us, and again, one that I think is unanswerable, but let's have a bit of a chat about it. Are the best minds from DFID going to remain in post?
Right, let me answer this slightly easier of the two questions, Peter, first, which is the second one. Obviously, I hope so. I think that there are some amazing people in DFID, and their commitment is such that mostly they're going to want to stick around and carry on in the new department. Clearly, there are other places that people can go to, multilateral organisations or into the NGO sector. But I would be optimistic that the best minds in DFID will go into the new department. And in fact, their being there, I think, will be really important to the prospects of ensuring that sustainable development remains a high priority within the merged department in the way that it certainly has been inside the Department for International Development. In terms of the underlying rationale, I mean, it's the Prime Minister made the statement announcing this, so he set out his reasoning and his thinking. I would say it is not unusual that those that have worked primarily on the Foreign and Commonwealth Office side in government often feel that it would be better to have a merger. Not everyone, but I think that is not an uncommon view. So he is a former Foreign Secretary, and I think he has a view based on that experience that because of the commitment to 0.7% having come in at a time of broader austerity, there was often a sense that you had this sort of strong and protected budget for DFID, whereas the Foreign Office had faced a lot of constraints and reductions in its own spending, and there's the potential to bring those two things together. I think he does have a view around the geography, and I mentioned the geography. The Prime Minister in his statement spoke about some of the concerns in Ukraine and the Balkans and the potential for assistance to be shifted there. And that is an area that I think people need to keep a close eye on in terms of what that shift might mean with respect to the poverty reduction focus in Africa and some of the issues around health and education that results is very much focused on. And the Prime Minister spoke about DFID, I'm slightly putting words into his mouth, but he sort of essentially said it made sense at the time in the 90s, but the world has moved on since then, was kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but kind of the argument that he made in his statement. And there has certainly been a strain of thought on the Conservative side that has felt for some time that it made more sense to bring the two things together in order to bring about that alignment. That's my best stab at setting out the rationale as I understand it. And it's quite important to understand that this is different to those who feel that the 0.7 itself should be abandoned. A very, very positive feature of what the government has said consistently through this is they have reaffirmed the 0.7%. So there is a different school of thought that would move away from the commitment to 0.7. That element of the cross-party consensus, I think, is still there and is still strong.
But they're going to spend it on other things, aren't they?
So that I think is what that for me is what the political debate now is all about. Where will the money go? And obviously, in the short to medium term, the impact of the lockdown is such that GNI is likely to be smaller, and therefore, even if DFID were continuing, there's a serious constraint going to be put on development assistance, and we're going to see reductions. And I think in that context, it is important to be making the case again for a focus on poverty reduction, the poorest countries, as well as on objectives around health, education, and climate change.
Thanks, Stephen. We're going to go. I've got a question that's sort of a follow-up to that, but I'll risk going to Richard in the London group, who's very helpfully used the raised hand function. Richard, we're going to go to you. Do you want to ask? I forgot to tell people how to do that. So Zoom experts, use the raise hand button. We're going to go to Richard from London.
Thanks, Aaron. And thanks, Stephen, also for your time joining us this evening. It's really interesting to listen to you and your thoughts. I've actually got a quick question on a different subject, which more talks to your experience as a Member of Parliament. In London, we've been trying to arrange some meetings with a number of MPs across London. We're hoping to arrange one with Catherine West over the next few weeks, which Layla, one of our volunteers, has been doing a lot of work on. I was just wondering, with parliamentary recess coming up on the 22nd of July, do you find, when you were an MP, did you find it easier to meet constituents in recess time or in parliamentary time? Just so we know sort of when to aim for.
I think a well-timed request for a recess meeting is a really good idea. You know, we're in slightly unusual circumstances because of some of the travel restrictions, but ordinarily in the summer, I would have 2 weeks off, and then the rest of the time would be looking at constituency activity. And actually a lot of the things that as a constituency MP you might do on a Friday when you're in the constituency, you can't do in August, you know, school visits, for example. So actually, I would suggest reaching out and saying, I know it's recess and you may be having some time off, but when you are working during recess, would you be available for a meeting? You may well find that that's productive and that you get a slightly longer meeting because there'll be less pressure from other places. I mean, it's probably a little bit different this year just because of the situation, but I certainly wouldn't think, oh, we won't suggest August because it's recess, because I think most MPs would be around at least for some of that summer recess and may well welcome the opportunity to have that engagement. And Catherine, I'm sure, knowing Catherine well, I'm sure she'd be really keen to meet the group.
Stephen, thank you. I'm going to combine two questions. So in the chat we had Ricky and Karen from Macclesfield asking, how can we keep track of the 0.7%? So put that one in there. And with that, Reg from down in Poole has asked, we are told that DFID is currently spending 73% of the UK aid budget. What has the other 23% been spent on? And is there a concern that these may be some of the issues that will receive more funding through the FCO?
So yeah, the figure has been in that sort of 73 to 75% range for a couple of years, and this came out of the aid strategy actually under the sort of tail end of the David Cameron, George Osborne period. The other money is a mixture, so some of it's programs that are run through the Foreign Office. Some of it is run through departments like health, which, you know, for understandable reasons. Some of it is through the business department. So you have these cross-government funds, and one that has had a lot of scrutiny is the Prosperity Fund. I think you raise a really legitimate point of concern that partly in the context of the merger, but perhaps more in the context of the economic situation, that if GNI, so gross national income, falls, and therefore the 0.7% is a smaller amount, will even that 73 to 75% be retained? Because if the other parts of the spending get protected, you might see the part that's currently Department for International Development smaller than that. I know that the previous permanent secretary in the Department for International Development said he felt that 75% was kind of a floor and it shouldn't go below that. I mean, we always, when I was chairing the committee, and we looked at this in some detail, this question of spending by other government departments, and the National Audit Office have looked at this as well in some detail. Again, it comes back to how I answered the first question about risk. Capacity, focus, is there the same priority given to poverty reduction? I'm not one of those who said, you know, everything should have gone through DFID. For some programs, it made sense for the Foreign Office or others to be involved, but really important that they are fulfilling the requirements of legislation, because we have legislation for how international development spending should be allocated, as well as international commitments as well. Point 7, the government has to, under the law that was passed in 2015, with cross-party support that enshrined point 7 into law, the government has to report to Parliament if it doesn't maintain the 0.7% commitment. So that's a very helpful piece of legislation in terms of keeping government to the 0.7.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to use, given we're in the last 10 minutes, so I'm going to combine a couple of questions again. This one is from Vicky up in Birmingham, or at least that's where she was the last time I spoke to her. She says, in terms of campaigning, are we best focusing on convincing MPs of our perspective on the merger so that they can influence decision making? Or should we be educating the public about why we feel this way so that there can be more public support for aid in the long term? And she says, I know we can do both. And by I think that she means that we should do both if we've got enough time in the day, but which is a higher priority at the moment? And I think related to that, in terms of how we do campaigning and how do we influence, there's a question from Bentley up in, I think, is it Linlithgow, Bentley, if I remember rightly. Bentley asks, will there be a separate minister under Dominic Raab responsible for development within the Foreign Office? Or will we be writing directly to Dominic Raab about development? So a couple of related questions about how will we influence, do you think?
Thanks very much, Vicky and Bentley. Let me answer Bentley's question first. I don't know the answer to that, and it might be that I've missed something in the last few days, because I know that the Secretary of State was before, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, the Secretary of State, was before the International Development Committee, and she may have answered that question. We do know that before 1997, when the International Development was previously part of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, there was a Minister of State for International Development. It was Baroness Chalker, Linda Chalker. I don't know, and I've not seen anything as to whether that will continue, whether that will be restored. Certainly some of the language around alignment and more coherence between development and diplomacy might suggest that there wouldn't be a separate minister, and that each minister would consider the development and diplomacy aspects of their region or their theme. It's possible they could go that way, but it may be that they do decide to have a minister. I think in terms of what that means, and Bentley's question, would you write to the Foreign Secretary, who will be the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Secretary? Probably yes, even if there is also a Minister for Development, because in the end, it's the Foreign Secretary who will be at the Cabinet table. And so simply persuading the Minister for Development will be perhaps not enough. It'll be persuading the person who's at the Cabinet table, who will be the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Secretary. I mean, Vicky's question really speaks to the dilemma that I think is always faced for this campaign. I think my answer is, in the very short term, the first is more important, because we are in a period where the government is looking at this, and it's not just about the merger, it's about the broader review that they're doing of their global policy, including diplomacy and development, as well as defence and security. So I would say in the short term, contacting MPs to raise the whole set of issues that we've talked about today on development, I would advise should be a priority. But you're absolutely spot on in identifying we have a broader challenge. You know, I think back to the 90s and going into 2000, 2005, some of those great campaigns about debt, cancellation of debt, leading into the Gleneagles Summit in 2005, the Millennium Development Goals. There was a real mobilization of the public at that time. And I think for a number of different reasons, the public is a lot more skeptical about our engagement globally, but including money that is spent on development assistance. So I think in the longer term, Vicky, the second part of your question is the key. You know, because if the public is mobilized behind this, then the numbers of people who are contacting their MP on this will be multiplied, and therefore more likely to be listened to by the politicians.
Thanks, Stephen. Something Della just popped in the chat, I think, is also really important to flag to folks, and it really echoes what you've been talking about. I mean, I think, you know, for a lot of people in the development sector, getting cabinet level representation for aid and development is really, really important. You know, it's something that we currently have, and there is a voice at that top table whose job it is to fly the flag for development and for poverty alleviation with our aid money. And we've put some details on that in the action sheet as well. So yeah, we think that's quite important, and a lot of people in the sector have been speaking out in support. Let's go to, we've got 3 minutes. So I'm looking through the chat box to see if I've got a couple I can combine. Or maybe let's go. We haven't gone to the phones. Can we go? I want to make sure that we've got a chance for people that haven't got access to the chat box to unmute themselves and yell something out. Does anybody that's called in or not asked their question yet want to unmute and speak up? Hearing none, we will go to a question from Jill. She asks, if the aim of the government is joined up thinking, shouldn't the Department of Trade and Industry be aligned with the setup, given that the government has announced it's going to sell arms to Saudi once again? That's not a loaded question at all. But I think it potentially speaks to sort of your earlier comments about the various different departments that are currently spending aid and involved in doing you know, international and foreign work.
Yeah, and one of the issues when I chaired the committee that we did a lot of work on was Yemen, and actually when I was an MP in Liverpool, which has a significant Yemeni community, we did a lot of work together about the tragedy of what is happening in Yemen. And there have been, I mean, to answer the question seriously, you know, there have been some voices in the past that have said combine trade with development, either to have trade and development together, separate from the Foreign Office, or all together as one department. And I think I do think an important element of advocacy is to place debates around trade and trade relationships in a broader context of our commitments to human rights, sustainable development, international humanitarian law. I think that is a really important part of any advocacy that is done around the place of this country in the world going forward.
Thanks, Stephen. That's an excellent answer to a tough question. I'm afraid we are getting very, very close to time. If somebody has a 30-second question, we can ask it. Otherwise, I think we might have to call it there. Well, very last call. No? Okay, you let Stephen off the hook.
Last one in the chat box that we didn't manage to get around to.
Oh, sorry, I missed it, Della. Do you want to make sure it gets asked then?
Yeah, I can see one from Amy. In your opinion, why did the government, Boris Johnson, decide to merge these two departments in the middle of a global pandemic? Why not before or after?
I think it's interesting because I think there had been an expectation either that this is something that might have happened earlier, so the before, as Amy puts it, either immediately upon the Prime Minister taking over from Theresa May or after the general election, and instead the government announced their review, and therefore that created the expectation of after. I'm no longer a politician, so I think I'll leave that to those who are still engaged in party politics to speculate about reasons. I mean, I do think, to be fair, this is something that Boris Johnson has openly supported for a long time and clearly wanted to take forward. It probably would have made more sense either to have done it at an earlier stage or to have awaited the outcome of the integrated review so that we have a sense of how this will now fit with the outcome of that integrated review. Because it is worth saying, you know, even if DFID does survive or were to have survived, there's still a whole set of questions that will arise from the broader look the government is having at its overall policy. And I think it is, when you're talking to members of parliament and others, it's really worth going in, yes, to talk about the merger, but also to talk about poverty reduction, sustainable development goals, the priorities that this new department would have.
Thanks, Stephen. We are really out of time here. I am going to throw in the chat box just a quick link to a DevX article that talks about the integrated review in a bit more detail that you mentioned in your answer. It's a big process that pulls together quite a few different bits of government, and I think, yeah, the timing around this and around the announcement is peculiar and possibly unfortunate. But anyway, we are where we are, and I think what we've heard from you tonight is really that there's quite a lot of hope and still a lot of work to do in terms of making sure that our foreign aid can continue to be as effective as it has been until now. We've come to the end of our time together. I really want to say a big thank you to Stephen for sharing all of your expert insider knowledge of the workings of Parliament, its relations with government on the topic of international development, and also in terms of scrutiny and oversight and how important that is. I'm sure that you'll agree with me that Stephen's shown very clearly why the way we administer UK aid spending is so important for the impact that it has on the lives of the people who are most affected by it. So thank you so much for making time this evening, for all of your commitment to international development.
Thank you, all of you. Thanks, everyone. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Great. So I'm just going to end this evening's call by thanking everybody for the continued action that you take. I know it's a lot harder than normal to get the attention of politicians during the COVID pandemic. It really has never been more important to make sure that they keep at least a part of their focus on international issues. And so if you're able to take this month's action, thank you so much. And as always, do please be sure to share any response you receive. It provides us with fabulous intelligence that allows us to do even more with the feedback that you get. So very much have fun with it all. I'm looking very much forward to seeing you again on the next Grassroots conference call. That's going to be on the first Tuesday of next month. That's Tuesday, the 4th of August. It's good night from me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Stay well.
Well.